accepted and affirmed for who we are at home, in our relationships with our families, in our houses of worship, with our healthcare providers, and if our institutions of daily life, like some of those I mentioned, our schools, our systems of care, are inclusive and respectful and don't include any kind of discriminatory practice. And we know that we can't really live totally openly and authentically without fear until we reach this ideal world. And we also know that we can't achieve our optimal mental health until we reach this ideal world. We know from years of research, including some of our own research on LGBTQ youth, as well as our Centers for Disease Control's research on LGBTQ youth, and other studies of our population more broadly, that LGBTQ people carry a heavier burden of mental health challenges. And that we also know that LGBTQ people of color carry a heavier burden due to the impact and the intersections of race and LGBTQ identity and mental health. So tonight, we really appreciate the opportunity to have a conversation and reaffirm our commitment to improving the landscape for queer people of color, and to build up the protective factors, especially among our younger people, and making sure we all can have greater access to culturally responsive mental health care. I'm very excited to introduce my colleague, JP Regis, who is the Senior Manager of our All Children, All Families program. That is our child welfare program that works with foster care and adoption agencies to become more LGBTQ inclusive. And JP has a personal commitment to and interest in reducing stigma and shame associated with living with mental health challenges, and I really want to recognize how he has stepped up. And this is the third year that he's led our participation in this event. So without further ado, please welcome JP Regis.
Thank you so much, Ellen. I really appreciate that. So as Ellen mentioned, my name is JP Regis. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm so excited to see everyone here in the building tonight. This is our third annual event for Minority Mental Health Month. It's really, really a thrill to be here today. And to all of those joining us via Facebook Live, welcome. We hope you enjoy this session. We'll be sure to keep you in mind as we move forward through today's event. So the first thing I just want to quickly note is that not only is this our third event, but we've been leaning into this work continuously for 3 years with the help of strong partnerships like that with Mental Health America and a number of other organizations like those who you'll see joining us for today's panel. We're really appreciative of those partnerships and our ability to enter this space because we recognize the importance of mental health in LGBTQ communities of color. So in a moment, I'm beyond thrilled to introduce our next presenter. Tom Hill is the Vice President of Practice Improvement at the National Council for Behavioral Health. And part of the National Council's work is really centered on what they refer to as mental health first aid. And I know that may be a new sort of way to phrase that for some folks, and Tom's gonna be diving into that in just a moment and explaining it. But before Tom comes up, I'd like to just share a really quick story. So I actually took the mental health first aid training back in 2017. Since then, there have been a number of opportunities for me to use that training, and I've found it helpful in my own life as well as in my connections with those that I care about. But there's one particular experience I want to share with you all today. So about maybe 3 months or so ago, someone who I care about very deeply began reaching out to me expressing some pretty challenging thoughts. They were going through a pretty difficult time. And I noticed these messages continued on for about a week, and as they continued, the messages actually became progressively worse, progressively darker, and I noticed that things were really heading into a bit of a troubling area. And I got that sort of pit in my stomach that you get when you're really worried about someone that you care about. Has anyone ever had that feeling? And something that can be really challenging in those experiences is when you don't know how to show up. Well, the really great thing about the mental health first aid training was that in that moment, even though I was very distraught and ultimately, kind of losing my cool a bit, I was still able to recall the training and the action steps that I needed to implement. And that person mentioned to me that that saved their life on that day. And I don't share that, to tout myself in any way for saving a life or anything like that, or necessarily to say that you'll have that same experience, but more so that you understand that there are tools out there that can really empower you and give you sort of a toolkit, if you will, to really show up in these situations for yourself, for your loved ones, and those that you care about, in a way that can really have a profound difference in their life. So without further ado, I'd like to bring Tom forward to discuss a little bit more about this really important training before we dive into our amazing panel discussions shortly after his presentation. Tom? And I'm going to be switching over to Tom's presentation, right?
Okay, thank you, JP. While he switches over, I'm just thrilled to be here. Thank you so much. My name is Tom Hill. JP introduced that I'm the Vice President of Practice Improvement at the National Council. I think the most important thing I want to tell you about myself right now is that I'm a gay man in long-term recovery from addiction, and that means I haven't used alcohol and drugs in over 27 years. And I tell you that because recovery has really informed so much of my lens of how I see the world, how I see my sexuality, and how I've been able to experience what these things look like both in my life and in my family's life and in the life of my community. So I just share that with you because the personal does often become political when we let it happen. I think that they made these. I'm just going to click all these on now because, last month we celebrated 50 years of Pride since the Stonewall Rebellion. And, a lot of what that rebellion was about were these three areas that plagued our communities and still plague our communities, I think. That our experience was regarded as illegal and criminalized, that our experience was regarded as immoral, and that our experience was regarded as sick or pathologized. And I think so when we talk, lots of changes have happened in 50 years, and lots of really great things have happened, but those things still sort of linger. And I think those are oftentimes the things that we're pulled back into by reactionary forces if we let that happen. And so I think we always have to sort of keep our eye on those three areas in terms of the progression of our LGBT movement moving forward. I also think that, and I think that piece about sick and pathologized, that piece about that we were regarded, our experience was regarded as a mental illness is something that we take issue with, but also it sometimes informs the way we respond to mental health conditions, because it's not something that we really want to talk about. But it's also something that nobody wants to talk about, which is why we're going to talk about mental health first aid, to give people some sort of a comfort zone of talking about and expressing these kinds of things. I also just wanted to say that the issue of trauma in our communities, both in LGBTQ and communities of color, both personal trauma, family trauma, historical and intergenerational trauma, have affected our experience in the way that we regard substance use and addiction and mental health conditions. And I think that the ways those play out and what we now call social determinants of health, when I started doing this work 25 years ago, we didn't have that terminology or health disparities, but it's a very helpful framework to look at how communities and individuals and families in those communities get affected by or get closed out of the healthcare system. So, we have stigma and discrimination up here, which I think are really closely interlocked. And so, and those things definitely impact the access to services that we get or don't get. And then the quality of care that we get or don't get. And I think a lot of these things are going to be talked about in the panels tonight, because I saw some of the questions, and I think they're really going to engender some really nice discussions going forward with that. But I think all of these things play into how we personally and how we as communities experience and then express these things around addiction and mental health. So we know that LGBTQ populations are more than twice as likely to have mental health conditions, twice as likely to have substance use or substance use disorders. African Americans are 20% more likely to report experiencing psychological distress, but 50% less likely to get treatment. So there's a disparity there. And then with suicide and suicidality and suicide attempts, we know that the experience of LGBTQ youth face a higher suicide rate, and 40% of trans folk have attempted suicide. So we have some research on that, and that's alarming in terms of looking at those things that are happening in our community, and we'll talk about some tools to talk about those. I think the flip side of that is I'm not the only person recovering in this room, I'm sure of it, or in the communities we're talking about, and that we do recover and we do get better, and that we do have an amazing core of resilience that we can draw upon with both individually and through each other in a way that we can get better and move forward. So mental health first aid was started in Australia, and now there's more than 1.7 million that have been trained. So we do a train-the-trainer kind of a program, and 18,000 instructors in all 50 states, Puerto Rico, and Guam. So that's a lot of people on the ground that have been trained and that have also been trained as trainers. It's an evidence-based practice. It was in the SAMHSA, that's the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration. They have something called NREP, that is the sort of registry of evidence-based practices, that no longer exists because they pulled it and revamped it, and it's just fresh out on the street with a new name, so fresh that I don't even know it, but we're still listed as an evidence-based practice. I think the thing about that we have a lot of research that demonstrates that the mental health first aid training is an effective strategy that promotes changes in attitudes and beliefs, promotes positive impact, and increases mental health knowledge, improves people's confidence in talking about these things, and this is especially with those who have had little or no training in these areas. So it really is based on lay people for lay people. It's not a clinical intervention. It's not counseling or therapy, although it's a vehicle to get there if somebody wants or needs that. So what it is, it's an 8-hour training. It helps people develop relationship with somebody who has a mental health problem or is experiencing a mental health crisis. It's sort of like CPR. It's given until appropriate treatment and support are received or until the crisis resolves itself. And like I said, it's not a substitute for counseling, medical care. It's not a substitute for peer support or paraprofessional support either. The aim of it is to demystify the whole topic, to increase mental health literacy, and to decrease the stigma in the workplace and in community settings. It helps people assess risk factors and warning signs, gives them information on various conditions like depression, anxiety, trauma, psychosis, and substance use. There's a 5-step action plan that we'll talk about in a minute that'll help people sort of work through a process. And it's also, there's curriculum for adults as well as for adolescents. So I talked about the action plan. It's a 5-step thing, and it's not necessarily linear, although these actually, can work in a nice linear kind of progression. The first one is to assess for risk of suicide or harm. So part of that is breaking the stigma of asking somebody if they have thought about suicide. It's something that most of us are not comfortable talking about, but we find that if that comfort is lifted and people feel more comfortable asking those questions, it puts the other person at comfort of answering those questions. And so it's sort of setting a tone from the very beginning of have you been thinking about hurting yourself? Have you been thinking of harming yourself? What does that look like for you? And really exploring that, bringing us to the second thing of listening non-judgmentally. And that's a skill, because a lot of times you hear things that we just create instant judgments on. And so it's really just sort of letting that go, really developing listening skills, because part of this is that the person feels listened to. We know that is a really important way of connecting with somebody. If somebody feels listened to and heard, you've made a connection with them. And to reserve judgment is, a way of also building that trust. The third is to give reassurance and information. So you're sort of setting a bar of normalcy about what they're talking about, but you're also giving them information about things that they may consider, which brings us to the fourth one, is to encourage appropriate professional help. So have you sought counseling? Have you thought about counseling? Can I help you find a counselor? Can I help you make a referral? But a very low threshold kind of engagement. So you're not coming on really strongly. And then encouraging self-help and other support strategies. So, do you know that there's peer support, that there's a support group that meets on Wednesday night in the church basement, that there's 12-step groups, being able to offer those kinds of resources. So it's a very simple kind of action plan. It's ALGEE, which is algae, and now we actually have this little mascot that's a koala bear named Algie, and that's sort of become a trademark of mental health first aid. So it helps people remember those 5 steps. Oh, we're going through this again, aren't we? So we've developed a lot of curriculum. And basically what happens is that when we train the trainers, it's free or low cost, but they buy the manuals. They buy the training manuals. And that's sort of how one of the ways that we generate budget to keep this going. So mental health first aid, it has its own curriculum in English and Spanish. There's a youth curricula that is in English and Spanish also, and that's geared for adults who are working with youth. That's a very important distinction, because now we have a teen curricula, and that's teens helping teens. So it's very peer-based in terms of an age group, and the curriculum, as you might imagine, is very different. I'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. And then over time, we've developed supplements. So we have one for higher education, junior colleges, tech schools, those kinds of things. We have first responders, we have military, we have older adults, and then we have EMT and fire department. So those are all specific to the kinds, it's all basically the same curriculum, but it's tailored to the kind of situations they're going to be in with the kind of people that they're going to be interacting with, which would be very different than a workplace curricula or somebody being comfortable talking to peers in terms of these kinds of issues. So it puts that spin on that. We've also created a series of cultural consideration guides that provide guidance on the delivery of mental health first aid to diverse communities and providing foundational understanding to our instructors about cultural congruence and cultural competency in terms of delivering these kinds of things to populations or people or groups that may be dissimilar to their own experience or similar to their experience. We're going to have a talk with the person who designed these slides. So we have 2 columns here, interrelated. One is the signs of things we may see in somebody as opposed to symptoms of what someone might feel. And I think it's important that when we talk about these things, it's like any one of these things in and of itself may not be an indicator. It's really if there's a combination of things that may point toward a direction, And they're really going to point toward the kind of questions we ask rather than the kinds of assumptions we're going to make. So, signs we may see what people we're interacting with over time. There may be a weight change. There may be withdrawing from social situations, irritability, changes in self-care or appearance, personality changes, tearfulness, indecisiveness or confusion, increasing alcohol or drug use, having a dramatic change in moods, overly self-critical. And again, these may not, in and of themselves, may not be things that may be something that may cause alarm. Tearfulness may just be something that's a little melancholy in the moment. But if they're added to some of these other things, it may be indicators. And then, asking the questions if somebody's feeling a lot of sadness or anxiety, low energy, that their sleep patterns are not happening in good ways, changes in appetite, chronic headaches, need for more substances over time, so that the substance use is increasing, the amount is increasing, the frequency is increasing, physical withdrawal, unexplained aches and pains, hopelessness, helplessness, thoughts of death or suicide. So these are things that may want to be asking people specifically about, are you experiencing any of these things? Again, not in a clinical kind of setting. It's a very sort of friendly, peer kind of exchange. So in an emergency or crisis, if someone, or you or someone you know, has tried to hurt themselves, get help immediately by calling 911. So all the training is done in such a way that there's an edge of your responsibility in terms of what your intervention is and who you hand that over to. I failed to mention in those supplements, we also created a supplement for opioid overdose response. And so it takes people how to go through administering naloxone. And the final step of that is always to call 911 and get people to the emergency department. And so these are some really handy numbers that I think everybody should have. You'll have a chance to review these slides. I don't know if they'll be sent out to you, but JP can get them to you. And we know about the Trevor Project. Trans Lifeline is another really amazing resource. The National Suicide Prevention Hotline, and then the Crisis Text Line. All of those really, really important resources. So the most exciting thing that's happened, so mental health first aid has caught on fire. It's like everybody is realizing that this is a really amazing training because it really does remove the stigma and gives people the comfort to talk about these issues. So we've partnered with Lady Gaga's Born This Way Foundation and started by piloting the teen mental health first aid in 8 schools. And in eight of those schools already, just in less than a year, already 16 suicide attempts have been, trying to think of the right name, have been avoided. So I mean, that's a really great outcome. Now we're piloting that to 20 additional high schools, and this is all through funding from Born This Way, and it's really a way to propel teen mental health first aid so that young people start feeling comfortable with these kind of issues with each other as well. This is just how to find courses or instructors in your area. You can go online for mental health first aid. You can click in your zip code, and it'll show you what upcoming trainings are happening. JP recommended it. I recommend it. It's a great resource for all of us. And that's our website, www.mentalhealthfirstaid.org. Go on there for lots of resources. Think this is a really, really good resource to work on the ground in our communities. So just put a final plug in for that, and then I'm going to turn it over to Racine, who's going to moderate the first panel. And have a great evening, everybody, and thank you so much for allowing me to present you this information.
Good evening, everyone. No, let's try that again. Good evening, everyone. I still didn't feel the love in the room. It is important I feel love because I give love and I desire it. Love is free and doesn't cost a thing. How are you, sweetheart? You all right? You didn't think I was going to single you out? You're the only kid in the room, so I had to single you out. To everyone in Facebook land, please like and share. To everyone here, good evening once again. I am Racine Pendarvis. I am the host of the Ask Racine show, which is here, first Wednesdays of every month at HRC. It's free, the greatest word in the English language. It is free, it is for us and about us. I welcome you all to come. It is next week, Wednesday, August 6th. Doors open at 7. Showtime starts exactly at 7 p.m. It's an experience that you will never forget. For all of those in Facebook land, you can follow me at RAYCEEN Pendarvis. Once again, I'm the queen of the shameless plug, and I plug everything. We're going to have a great time. We're going to get through it. At times, it's going to be very heavy. It's going to be very emotional, but we're going to get through it, and we're going to push through, and we're going to love, and we're going to embrace. So before we begin, you've been sitting a minute. They told me to tell you don't stand because you block the cameras, but the camera is right there, so it will not be blocking anyone, correct? Everyone stand up. This is your affirm. I believe in affirming the spirit in everywhere I go. I want everybody to breathe in and let go. Let it all out. Even though we're on Wednesday, the hump day, it's been a rough day. Wrap your arms around yourself. Close your eyes and love yourself. You are the greatest gift. You are unique. You are perfect. You are one of a kind. There is no one like you ever in this world. Now I want you to turn to your neighbor and give them a hug and tell them you love them. That's right, love. It doesn't cost a thing. It's free, and it doesn't cost a thing. Thank you, my beloved. To the young man, you know I single out everybody. Everybody have a seat. You too late. You moved too quick. You right here who didn't stand. Come here, sweetheart. See, you got to follow. I'm your principal, graduating class of 2019. You got to follow the principal. I could just tell I just wanted to give you an extra hug. How are you, my beloved?
I'm good.
What's your name?
Jonathan.
Jonathan, and where are you from?
Originally from Haiti.
Haiti, the beautiful land of Haiti. Beautiful brown, beautiful people kissed by the sun.
Yep.
Welcome, my beloved. Yes, it is. Sit on down. Take a seat with Beyonce and Kelly. Ladies and gentlemen, Destiny's Child. I'd like to introduce our amazing panelists. We have amazing, wonderful panelists that we have assembled from all over. They all have bios because they all come correct. Our first is Eric Spearman, the Executive Director, Center for the Native American Youth at the Aspen Institute. Eric Spearman, I hope I'm pronouncing that right. If I'm not, please forgive me. Okay, good. Carrie, the Kettle of the First Nation, is the Executive Director of the Center of Native American Youth at the Aspen Institute. Before joining CNAY team, Eric led the field outreach and advocate for the Poverty to Prosperity program at the Center for American Progress. Before American Progress, he served as the Minority Counsel for the U.S. Senate Committee on Indian Affairs, where he led the development of Stand Against Violence and Empower, which is known as SAVE. The Native Women's Act, signed into law as a part of the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization of 2013. Before joining the Senate, Eric was appointed in 2011 to serve as the political advisor of the U.S. Department of Education Office of Safe Drug-Free schools. He began his career in Washington, D.C. at the National Congress of American Indians Policy Research Center. Eric holds a GD from UCLA School of Law and an MA in the American Indian Studies for UCLA Graduates Division, and a BA from Winter College. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for Eric Spearman. Our next wonderful panelist is Laquanda RobertsBuckley, MSSW Director of Outreach Mental Health America, Outreach Manager in Partnership and Community Outreach Department on Mental Health America. She has a background in direct service, provision, advocacy, and the development of implications of the outreach efforts aimed at increasing mental health awareness and integration of recovery among diverse communities and populations. Ladies and gentlemen, Laquanda RobertsBuckley. Tia Doe, PhD, Chief Clinical Operation Officer of the Trevor Project. Tia Doe, PhD, is the Chief Clinical Operation Officer at the Trevor Project, the world's largest organization for suicide prevention for LGBT youth. Dr. Doe oversees all of the Trevor's Project's crisis service programs, as well as our volunteer community at Trevor Lifeline, Trevor Text, and Trevor Chat. She is a licensed clinical psychiatrist and a long-term advocate for the LGBT rights. She received her master's degree in development psychology from Columbia University's Teachers College and completed her doctorate in clinical psychiatry at Fordham University. During the course of her studies, Dr. Dole focuses on LGBT people of color in early psychosis. One of her passions is normalizing mental health conditions with communities of color and helping people get access to service. She is based in New York City, and she has taken her seat. Bless her heart. These are our amazing panelists who will help you through this wonderful process of asking questions, healing, and coming together. Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to go into our first set of questions, and I'll pose this to whatever panelist would like to take it. Why is it important to talk about mental health in marginalized communities, and particularly LGBTQ communities of color?
I'll begin. Laquanda RobertsBuckley. It's important, one, for myself. I am a person who self-identifies as an individual who lives with and manages bipolar 1 disorder with a history of psychosis. It's important to have these discussions because we need individuals to see reflections of themselves when mental health is brought up. Sometimes when mental health is brought up, we are only seeing the majority of the population. We're only seeing Caucasian Americans discussed. We're not seeing queer people. We're not seeing people of color. We're not seeing other individuals who are marginalized. And so it makes us feel as if these systems are not created for us, and these systems do not have the capacity to cater to our needs. So it's important that we know that there are systems in place that can serve us and that we can get the help that we need when we are in the positions before we're in a point of crisis.
Important fact, and we'll actually, at a point, we will take like 2 questions from the audience if we do have time. This question is to Tia. We all get messages early in life, maybe at home, maybe at church, or extended family, that shape the way we think about mental health. Be it asking for help, be it overly emotional, privacy, etc. What can parents or other caregivers do to avoid planting the seeds of stigma early on?
Well, I can speak as a parent and also as a psychologist, which is that the way that we were raised always sort of leaks out onto how you raise your own children. So, the first time I said to my daughter, "I will embarrass both you and me right here," it reminded me of my own mother, who would have embarrassed me right there. And so I think that it's really important to look back at our own history and think about the ways in which we felt shamed, or invalidated by having our own experience. Because it's one thing to say to parents, like, well, be careful, don't say this, don't say that. I think it's actually easier for parents to think back to the times where they were told, you shouldn't feel this way, no, you're not this, no, be quiet. All those times where their own experience was invalidated by their own parents, and then taking a moment to notice when they're doing it themselves, and taking a step back and realizing, oh, I remember being in that position, and I don't want to repeat the same pattern. So, one of the things that I hear a lot from parents is, well, I don't want to feel like I tiptoe. I don't want to feel like I'm walking on eggshells. And the first thing I always say to them is think back to you, who you were, because that's your child. They're very similar to you, regardless of their orientation, regardless of their gender identity, and taking a moment to reflect back into their own past. And I think that's a really good way to have the parents start thinking about ways that they wish things could have been different, and the ways in which they could make things better for their own child.
And I would like to add is that it doesn't take a clinical voice for a parent to be able to communicate to their child. I think it is those simple questions of when a child is experiencing emotions, validating those emotions, and then allowing that child to know that it's okay to experience that. I had a child, my own child, who had a breakdown at school, and instead of calling me, she went to the school counselor. And so when she came home to tell me that, I validated, you did the right thing. That was, mommy's proud of you. And I think we need to validate our children's emotions so that we can get past that stigma, because it starts early on when they fall and they cry. And we're not just dusting them off and say, oh, you will be okay. We're showing genuine concern about, in this point, you're emotionally hurt or you're physically hurt. So if we're showing concern about a child being physically hurt, then we need to show that same level of concern when they're emotionally hurt and ask those same questions. Are you okay? How are you doing? Doing those follow-up things. And it doesn't take hardcore clinical language to be able to do that.
You just reminded me, something that I hear a lot from parents is also, I don't, if I'm too soft on my child, especially of children of color, especially, born at male children of color, I can't be soft on them, or else they're going to be taken advantage of in this world. And I think that, sort of disabusing parents of the notion that you have to be harsh with your child for them to become successful people, for them to become with the ability to move through the world. And I think that within communities of color, I hear that constantly, which is fear that if I don't teach them, if I'm not, standing there, that they will be hurt, which does happen. It does happen. So it's a legitimate fear in a certain way.
And that's so important. I think back at my mother, who's an amazing woman who is 92, just turned 92, and I'm one of her caretakers, and she is the greatest gift God gave me. She raised and educated 5 black men in Washington, D.C. at a time that was very hard to do, that had never been on drugs, had never been in jail. But the greatest gift I still today keep with me, my mother never always, whenever we had a problem or something went wrong, she always said to us, she never said, I told you so. She always said, well, what did you learn from that? And it required me to stop and think about whatever the trauma, whatever was going on, to have a thought process. As we sat down and we thought about it, and collectively we came up with a solution. And I think that's so important. And whenever, because see, I'm a grandparent, and that's a wonderful experience. And now when I see children or young parents with their children, especially LGBT children, because you can clock them early. You can clock them early. When there's a little mini me in you in a room. And you always kind of go over to that parent and you kind of give them that extra love that they need. and let them know that it's going to be all right. And your child is wonderfully and perfectly made. And if Timmy wants to put on a tutu, let him twirl. And if Susan wants to play with a football, let her play with a football. And just let them be. And it's so important that they need to, and parents need encouragement. They need other folks to advocate for them as well and say, it's going to be all right. It'll be fine. So I'm going to give this question to Eric. What do we know about how one's racial or cultural identity may impact their approach to seek mental health treatment? And do we see that changing with the younger generation?
Nice to be here, and I really appreciate the opportunity. Is that better? Okay, there we go. We're a national leadership and advocacy platform for Native American youth across the country, and I think one of the most important things to understand about the young people in our communities is really about culture. We have the highest suicide rate of any ethnic group in the country. Regularly when we're out in classrooms on certain reservations, we'll have 3 or 4 kids raise their hands because they lost friends in a week that were 10 or 11 years old. And all of this really stems back to culture. And my own great-grandfather went to a boarding school up in Canada, which was part of a federal process in the U.S. and Canada that was really aimed at removing Native children from their families, forcing them to be in boarding schools and disciplining them for speaking their language and practicing their customs and traditions. Before these kinds of policies were imposed on our communities, we didn't really have a concept of something like suicide and a lot of these mental health issues that unfortunately plague our communities, and they plague Indigenous communities around the world. So what really gives me a lot of hope, and we especially see this when it comes to LGBT, Two-Spirit, and queer youth in Native communities, is that young people are really on the forefront of rebuilding these cultures that have been dismantled through a lot of very intentional policies and systems. We have some of the highest serving in the foster care system, juvenile justice system, with a lot of other communities of color. But young people are undertaking programs to learn from their elders to rebuild their languages. It's amazing to me. I've been out in communities where young people have found one elder who's the last one speaking their language in their community and started an immersion school, and now they have a bunch of little kids that are learning it. And we're really seeing the impact when it comes to LGBT and Two-Spirit communities particularly. For those of you who aren't as familiar with a lot of our sexual and gender identities when it comes to Indigenous communities, Two-Spirit's sort of a collective and political term for a whole collection of different identities across the country that were there before colonial policies came into play. And they were kind of at the confluence of sexual and gender identity, but there were various different roles in different tribal nations across the country. And what's happening now is a lot of young people are asking their elders, what were our ways before all of this happened? And that's going along with things like their language, education, and a lot of other programs that they're using to rebuild it. And what we know from our young people across the country is culture is what was taken away from our communities over generations and caused a lot of intergenerational trauma, but it's also the answer to everything, whether it's education, whether it's about making our young queer, LGBT, and Two-Spirit young people feel included again and having a role in their culture and community as they once did. This is really what I see young people organizing around, and that's what really excites me, and I know that culture is really going to be the answer, and I know that that has a lot to do with a lot of other communities too. I think what I love to see with our young people is they are reaching out to so many other communities to say, you have culture too, even non-native communities, and you should see that culture as power and resilience. So I've got a lot of hope actually for the future when it comes to mental health.
I love that. It's so important. Can I just tell you, I love growing up, people always, and still today, people always say, Racine, how do you identify? And I know that this generation loves correct terms. I'm from a different generation because I'll be 70 in 2020. So that means, and you don't have to tell me I look good, I know it. You don't have to tell me, I know it. Suffer. So, we used to say I was a gender blender, but when people ask how to identify, I always say human being. You can't offend me if you say Miss or Mrs., because I'm a father of 5, mother of many, grandfather of 2. And I always embrace being a two-spirit person, because that's who I am, and I walk in my light. And I understand that this generation especially, and I always have to be reminded that the importance of always saying, how do you identify? And that's so important, because you want to be seen as how you identify. If it's two-spirit, if it is them, there, that, me, I, you, however, you want to be identified, and it's so important that we do that, and that creates that cultural identity and all of that. But I know that Laquanda wanted to answer and wanted to add on to that. Did you have something you wanted to add on to my beloved?
I think when it comes to cultural identity, it's just really understanding that in certain cultures the language doesn't exist to really identify what's going on with a person. When certain cultures, they don't understand the concept of what is depression when a person is experiencing certain things. So there's this level of education and communication that has to happen from within, from people that they trust, and we have to encourage our children as they're growing up to go into these fields so that they can see reflections of themselves, so that they can be able to trust the systems that we're saying that this is where you need to go to receive the help.
And it's so important. I think about people of color and the stigma when it comes to therapy. That's a big word. That's a naughty word for some folks at home, therapy. Always people think you can pray it away. And I believe in the God of your understanding, or however you get there, and I'm not going to knock that. But sometimes you need both. You need prayer and therapy, and find out a regimen that works for you. Because folks are still today in 2019 sitting at home in the dark, thinking that they're the only one dealing with depression. I look at Facebook, and folks are sitting on Facebook talking about, I feel like killing myself. Immediately when I see that, I immediately send them a message, a 1-800 number. I inbox them. I put my number. Call me. I send them. Where are you? What city you are? Let me get you some help. And sometimes folks are just asking. And sometimes what I learned, what is the most important thing is sometimes they just want to be seen. They want to be heard, and they want to know that they're here and they matter. Because sometimes you feel like you're in that space all alone, and you're not. I don't think there's a time any of us have not thought about checking out. Why sometimes requiring being so powerful and being so in your light and being so who you are. Sometimes that's very scary for young people. It's very scary when we come, especially for folks of color, who have been told you can't be that. Oh, no, that's too much. Timmy, no, Timmy, don't twirl today. You got to butch it up. And you're not encouraged to be free and to be free and to walk in that freedom, whatever that may look like for Timmy or Susan or however you want to be identified. We don't celebrate and don't tell our children it's nothing wrong with you and you're not alone. And too many times people have been traumatized in their youth and carrying it into their adulthood.
If I could add something to this, which is that part of the issue with seeking mental health treatment is because there are so few people who look like you when you go. And so when you're going to see a therapist who really sees you as a demographic rather than an individual, I think that's really off-putting. I would say, I'm a clinical psychologist. I see LGBTQ folk in New York City, and I specialize in people of color. I know the 4 other Black therapists who see LGBTQ, and we all know each other and we refer within each other. But in terms of becomes even smaller when you're talking about the LGBTQ community, because you might find a Black therapist who might say, make faces or misgender you during the session, or make assumptions about what you think and feel. And so part of it is for me personally, I'm always like, please go to grad school, get your MSW, get your PhD, because we do need more therapists of color and psychiatrists of color who are going to be able to see our young people clearly and not through a film of their own preconceived notions. Not for nothing, a lot of the medication is also tested on sort of white male men, so the dosages are not made for people of color or for women, and so people have all these negative reactions to medications, and then the doctors are saying that to them, well, just suck it up. It'd be better to have these side effects than to have your mental health condition, and so there are a lot of things that kind of come into play. So if anybody is here is thinking about going to grad school, don't go into a ton of debt, but consider it.
And I just want to underscore that and just give a perspective from, particularly our rural reservation communities. That is so important and so true. And there's a systems piece to this that's really important, because Indian Health Service, which is the frontline federal provider on most reservations, it's primarily a lot of non-native physicians, therapists, psychiatrists, serving a primarily native population. And I think one of the other big struggles is that a lot of our young people just want professions to come home. Too often we have to ship out all our young people to go get an education, and they can't find any economic opportunity to come back home, and these should be good jobs, but unfortunately with some of those providers, not only do they not pay well enough, but the pathways aren't there. And then when you get to that extra layer of the LGBT identity, it gets even more challenging. And I think together, I do think that in general, we need to have a stronger call to action across both communities of color, but also these systems that are serving urban, rural, and native populations, to really think about what do we have to do across the public and private sector to actually get young people into those positions, because they are so impactful. They provide good employment at home, whether that's in the city or back in the res. And I just think that it always gets put in the back burner, and I think we need to change that.
I think one thing is just we can't forget the power of storytelling and allowing people to see those examples. Self-disclosure, myself, I'm the Director of Outreach of Mental Health America, but I'm actually leaving that position to go back to be a therapist, because I saw that there was a need, and I saw that people needed to see a reflection of themselves. I saw that people needed to have someone to come to and feel that level of comfort, but it also comes with a story that has to be told that, okay, I am a Black queer woman, I am someone who manages bipolar disorder, and when you're carrying those stories, it impacts and allows another person to say, hey, this is a field that's worth going into, so that someone else, I can be what I needed for someone else. And storytelling among marginalized communities is so powerful. And we have utilized that for so many years. And I think that continuing to utilizing, storytelling and what that means to getting our communities to understand how important it is for us to represent us, and for us to see us, and for us to help heal us is just a powerful thing that we can't overlook.
That's so important and so true. I always, when I walk into a to a healthcare provider, I always say, well, I'd like a cute man, to sit across from, I'm gonna do a physical. Is he cute? But sometimes I find my best power comes from women. Black women have been my strongest advocates, who have been there and advocating for so many LGBT people. And they have been a force to reckon with, and these amazing women. And once again, it's so important that we do need to see folks that look like us, because one thing, it makes you feel comfortable. It makes you feel at ease. And when you're comfortable with someone, you can tell them your secrets. Let me take 2 questions. Do anyone have a question? I know there's some questions in the room. Keep it rolling? All right, I'm going to keep it rolling. I'll pose it to because the panelists, save them for later. Think about it. Write it down. Tell a friend. So let me take this to my panelists. What are the 2 ways that you hope to see the mental health field advance to meet the needs of LGBT communities of color?
One way I would say more providers that are open and willing to accept individuals as they are without that person feeling like they have to go through an interview process in order to find someone that they need when they need them. Because it can be difficult calling when you're already in crisis and you're calling and you're saying, is this therapist LGBTQ friendly? That's a question that you should not have to ask. And I think that's one of the things that I'm hoping to see in the future, that it's just standard practice for you to go in and actually work on your issues and not have to be concerned of whether or not this person is going to accept or reject you.
That's so important when you're in crisis. My next question, how have you seen the mental health treatment improve mental health challenges in LGBT communities of color?
I actually, I'm thinking about the way that LGBT communities of color are being represented in media lately. I feel like there is more visibility and more curiosity about the experience, which then influences clinicians. And I do think that, over time, I'm sort of, I train, clinical psychologists for years, and I find that it is, again, the young people who are bringing the conversation forward. And as the old ones die off or retire or, do whatever they're going to do, I find it's the young ones who are kind of moving the conversation forward and bringing creativity and really pushing the boundaries in a way that they haven't been pushed before. So I will say, even thinking about, what I would love to see too, to answer the prior question, is actually sort of faith-based organizations to kind of get on board with the LGBTQ young people to learn more about the communities, because it's sort of like it spreads from there too, and that's where people are trained. So, but that was to your prior question.
But I love that. I think it should be all hand in hand. I think many folks who are called to ministry should be also have some mental health training. And those of mental health training should also have some force to identify with those who are faith or folks who may not be non-believers, and meet people, because sometimes folks feel like if you are a non-believer or if you are Methodist or this, folks got issues with that. So I feel like folks need to be open all across the board. It needs to be walking hand in hand, and that's so important when it comes to healing. When it comes to, and talk about healing, how do you three find your center? How do you find your chi? How do you begin to heal? What do you do to help yourself heal?
I guess I'll go first. I have an awesome psychiatrist. I have an awesome psychologist. But they both tell me that I have an awesome toolbox. I meditate. I color. I do affirmations on stones. I walk. I teach groups myself on relaxation, on social skills, on support groups. I tell people no when I can't do it. I stop myself. I give myself permission to take a vacation. And if I'm not well, I say that I'm not well. If I'm not okay, I say that I'm not okay. And I don't apologize for it at all.
I love you. Sometimes we need to say no. There's nothing wrong with saying no. I used to always say, well, baby, let me think about it. Or sometimes do stuff and find yourself, folks will call you and they give you that old excuse, child, my rent is about due, my light's about to cut off, and you find yourself going into debt, and you got to learn to say no. How about you, my beloved doctor?
So I lift weights. I change up my workout constantly with goals, and I do like to shame men in the gym, which is terrible. But and then what else do? I bake. I do a lot of baking, and I do vinyasa yoga. So, and then I guess it's a lot of sensual kind of stuff, physical stuff that I do and I read, and I don't watch television, which I think is really helpful.
Reading is fundamental. It is so important. You know, so read books can take you to so many places and allow you to use your imagination. How about you, Eric?
I think two of the things that really helped me find my center the most, I bead. I have my great-grandfather's bead loom, and I actually work with my staff and community members to learn different designs and really meditate over that. And then for me, nature is really important. We have a central philosophy at the Center for Native American Youth that nature needs to be at the center of healing, and we need to put people back in the natural world. So we have some outdoor leadership training programs that actually bring youth of color together with indigenous youth to do outdoor leadership training and really help heal in the outdoors. So that's always important to me.
How about that? Communing with the rocks, the moons, the sun, the stars, the earth, the dirt, the water, the river. I talk to them faithfully. I even talk to my cats and dogs. You know, animals are healing. Animals are so healing.
What do you do?
What do? I stretch, I dance, I twirl. I live my best life, you know, and I find that my family is the greatest. My children are my children. I have 5 children, 2 grandchildren. I'm a father of 5 and mother of many. And I walk, I exercise, I drink plenty of water. I love water. It's the nourishment of life. But, and that, you know, and I believe in just taking care of yourself. It's important, you know. Folks, take care of yourself, whatever that may look like. Turn on some music, twirl around the house, put on some Aretha Franklin, some James Brown, or Nicki Minaj, or Adriana Grande, whatever works for you. Put on some music and twirl, honey, and get it in. You know, twerking is a great exercise. Go on to twerk, honey. Stand on your porch, twerk. Twerk at the bus stop. Twerk at McDonald's and Starbucks. Just twerk for no reason, honey. You know, just make yourself feel good. So give our wonderful panelists a round of applause. Thank you so much. So as they exit, we're going to bring on our next set of panelists. And as we bring on the next 3, is that correct? 4? Ladies and gentlemen, our first one is Louis A. Ortiz. Is an HIV-positive queer. Yes, take your bag, hold your bag. Because you know everybody ain't saved. Hold your bag just in case you want it and you got your gun in there and guess you got to run out. Yes, grab all your identification. Run with you, honey. Louis has been an HIV activist and artist for over 20 years. He has worked with influential national recognized agency and has been in the intricate part of HIV prevention and youth development programming in Philadelphia. He's the director of the LGBT Health and Rights Advocates for Youth, where he works in partnership with young people living with HIV to combat stigma, and hosts the YouTube series for LGBT youth, Kikis with Lewis. And I'm, you know, outside of the organization, Louis is the creator, and I always mess that up. Let me come over. What is the you tell me. What's the creative, your YouTube thing? Because I always mess it up when I say it, honey. I need to hear it from you.
The Gran Varones, which is a storytelling project for Latino and for Latinos, gay, queer, bi, trans men.
I love it when you say it so much better than I do. And I mess it up all the time.
Word I know.
Yes, honey. You say it so much better. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for Louis. Our next panelist is Tori Cooper, a BA Executive Director and founder of Advocates for Better Care Atlanta, LLC Consulting. Ms. Tori Cooper, BA, is an Executive Director, founder of Advocates for the Better Care Atlanta, LLC Consults, which is a grassroots community-based organization dedicated to achieving health and financial equality for transgender communities and people living with HIV. Give us a round of applause for this wonderful Tori Cooper. Our next one is Dior Vargas, MS MPH, feminist mental health activist. Dior Vargas, MS MPH, is a Latino feminist mental health activist. She lives with depression, anxiety, and traits of borderline personality disorder. And she is a suicide attempt survivor. She is the creator of People of Color and Mental Illness Photo Project, responsible to the indivisible of people of color in media representation of mental illness. She is also the editor of Color of Mind, a photo essay book based on photo projects. Dior tours the country, giving keynotes, hosting workshops, and speaking on panels. Her works incites and have covered in media outlets such as the New York Times, US Today, Forbes, Newsweek, and the NBC News Latino. Dior is the recipient of numerous awards, including the White House Champion of Change for Disability Advocates Across Generations and under the Obama administration. Dior has a BA in the study of women and gender from Smith College, and an MS in the publishing from Pace University, and a MPH from the New York University. She's a native New Yorker and currently lives in New York City. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for Dior Vargas. Our final panelist, ladies and gentlemen, is George M. Johnson, writer and activist. George has written for major niche media outlets like Teen Vogue, Entertainment Tonight, NBC, The Root, Ebony, Them, Into, The Griot, VSB, Black Youth Projects, and several other national media publications. He writes on topics ranging from race, gender, sex, HIV, intersectionality, politics, culture, health, and pop culture. He is never afraid to go there and ask the tough questions. George M. Johnson's current memoir is called All Boys Aren't Blue. The memoir takes stories from his life growing up as a queer Black teen to show readers how you can fight for yourselves and allies and struggle for equality and all of those amazing things. Publicity date is set for winter of 2020. George is an HIV and LGBTQ plus activist, serving as a state spokesman for HIV Stops With Me campaign, and being called upon to discuss various issues facing the LGBTQ plus community from several rights leaders to politicians. Ladies and gentlemen, put your hands together for George M. Johnson. These are all of our amazing panelists. Yes. Is it me or I'm just hot? I'm the only person hot in here? It's all right. When you get over 55, you'll have flashes. Young people, come on. It's a wonderful thing. It's all right, get a fan, carry it with you wherever you may go. Whew, it's your own air condition. I like to pose these questions to our wonderful, amazing panelists. In no particular order, just feel free to jump in. How does having multiple marginalized identities impact your mental health? Who would like that? They all looked down at you, George. George?
I guess I can start. Having multiple marginalized identities, how it impacts your mental health. You don't just walk out the house as one thing. So it's like I don't just walk out the house as a Black male-presenting person. My identity, I'm pretty effeminate in nature, so I also walk out the house as a queer person. When you think about like your mental health, a lot of times, especially when you're Black or brown, a lot of times people will ask you that you have to be like Black first in everything that you do. Everything that you do is like, oh, but it's about being Black first, about being Black first. But a lot of times people don't realize I live in Black community. So a person like myself who lives in Flatbush, when I walk out the house, I'm not thinking as much about like my Black identity around a community full of Black West Indian people. I'm thinking about my safety because my queer identity is what is presenting. So mentally, I have to think about that when I'm centered in Black community. Now, when I'm in other spaces where there are other people, white people, Asian people, and anti-Blackness is gonna appear, I then have to think about the intersections of my identity. And I have to think about, well, in this room, I'm always like mentally thinking how I'm showing up in different rooms and in different spaces and how people are gonna react to it. I think as a queer person, safety is always on my mind. I'm never at a time where I don't feel like I'm in a state of being defensive. Like, I'm always thinking about, okay, if I enter this room or if somebody approaches me, where's the nearest exit? Or if this thing happens, that I'm always standing. I know it sounds crazy, but I'm always standing in a position that I can swing from my right fist because I'm dominantly right-handed. But I'm always thinking about how I have to protect myself and always being on guard to do that. And I think that plays a role, because to always have to be in a constant state of being defensive, it just wears down on the body at some point.
I feel you. That's why I carry a gun and a Bible. I'll shoot you and pray for you later.
So may I have an opportunity to respond?
Yes, my beloved.
So as a black trans woman, black is the first part of me. It is the part that people see before they may realize my trans identity. And I also live in the South, so people may hear my accent and my somewhat deep voice, which is even deeper because of the pollen here. But people will identify those things about me. And I think it's important to understand that there's no group of people in the United States who could win the oppression Olympics versus a black trans woman who lives in the South. We talk about marginalized, and marginalized is an adjective that simply describes the layers of oppression that people face. And as a black trans woman, I am one of those people. Everything that all of you experience as a black trans woman, that is part of our existence, plus some issues that are totally unique to our communities, because there are a whole bunch of different black trans woman communities as well. So I think it's important to understand when we're talking about marginalization, that's a public health word that takes the place of oppression. So we're talking about levels of oppression. And we know that in this country, there's history of black people, and I define us as black with a capital B, as black people who have been oppressed and who continue to be oppressed in many different ways. And then as women, regardless as to how you got to your womanhood, that we have been oppressed and continue to be oppressed, sometimes in very different ways. And it's people who live in the South that we are oppressed and continue to be oppressed and have historically been oppressed. And unfortunately, that's going to continue. So we talk about marginalizations, and I think it's important first to understand that we're talking about different layers of oppression and the things that people would use in a negative way against us.
How about that? What has been your experience? Been like identifying mental health treatment and what forms that you feel address the full dimensions of your identity, particularly your identities that are marginalized by society? I'm gonna repeat that question. What has been your experience been like identifying mental health treatment in whatever forms that you feel address the full dimensions of your identity, particularly your identities that are marginalized by society? I want to hear from Jose.
I'll talk again. I'm
and
the
Jose
quiet
won.
one.
Okay, you the quiet.
I'll talk again, though.
Okay. I would thought Louis was going to jump in. I call Louis Jose because I always see the two of them in the same room, so please forgive me.
I thought he'd be here today.
I'm going to tap Louis on the shoulder in a minute. So for black trans women, for trans women in particular, and for transgender people or people of trans experience, finding holistic therapy and holistic mental health is a huge challenge. It's better in some parts of the country where there may be laws or mental health facilities that are more inclusive, but it is nearly impossible in other parts of the country to find any place that totally gets you and totally treats you and honors you in the way that you should be treated. And what's important to remember out of that is that if you are being provided a service by someone who doesn't honor who you are in your entirety and in your wholeness, then there are some times where they're actually doing more harm than good. And so that can vary. What is supposed to help your mental health can actually impede your mental health.
How about that? So you're talking about double trauma.
Quadruple trauma.
How about that? How about that? So my next question, How have your experiences as a trans, non-binary, and or bisexual person of color impacted your mental health?
So as someone who identifies as queer, because my interpretation of bisexual is that there's only two genders and there's this binary. And so for me, I identify as queer, and being someone who identifies that way with, a mother who's actually coming around. I was actually afraid to go to Pride this year because I was afraid she was going to say something, because in the past she's seen my Twitter bio and seen queer activist in it, and she'll call me and tell me like, oh, family's gonna see or other people are gonna see, please remove it. So I'll remove it, wait like 5 to 10 minutes, and then put it right back on, because she's just not gonna determine how I identify. And so it is difficult. Also referring to the last question, thinking about how to even navigate the mental health care system and trying to find someone who is a person of color, who identifies as queer or trans, that's something that's gonna be very difficult to find. Also, if you find someone who doesn't have those identities, are they going to be culturally competent or culturally sensitive? Are they going to be understanding of where you're coming from? Are they going to be trauma informed? And so it can be very hard to navigate systems like these. But I also want to acknowledge the privilege that I have, being light-skinned, being able-bodied, and having a certain level of education. Those are certain things that I'm very privileged to have, and so that makes my experience a lot easier than other people. But those are just some of the thoughts that I had so far.
How about that? Louis? Okay, you sure? I can feel it bubbling over. It's coming. I can feel it bubbling. You wait for me to give you the right question. All right.
Racine, I was going to add something.
Please do.
And I also think that it's important that we talk about what it's like, how it affects your mental health, especially when you're a person who has a lot of visibility as well. I think now we're becoming a generation where the lie that was told was that visibility and representation is what's going to fix a lot of the trauma in our community. The more that people see us, the less they'll harm us, and that's just not the case. We're becoming more visible. We're getting more shows. We're getting more books. We're getting more followers. We're getting more of everything, and those people are afforded a form of safety, but even still, they don't have safety either. Your proximity to fame or to celebrity, even as a queer person across all of the letters, it doesn't provide any additional safety for you. But what it does give you is it gives you more mental, it gives you more things that you have to think about, because you're representing people now, and you have a lot of people who are now looking up to you as these voices within community and these voices of your generation. And so even when, if you're somebody who could seek out mental health treatment before, like I used to have a therapist, now me seeking out a therapist looks different to the world, right? Even though it's still something that's necessary for me, and even though it's still something I always preach about and talk about, but there are a lot of people who we know, especially with social media, who live their lives publicly. Every little thing that happened to them, they go online, they talk about it. People who are queer but moving into spaces of visibility, when you do that, it brings the world into your space, and it brings hate, and it brings a whole lot of other caveats that we're just now having to learn as this first real generation of people, of queer people who are living public lives and now having to push back against a lot of hetero norms, having to push back and having seats at the table with politicians and having seats at the table in these rooms. And so I think it is now a different dynamic of mental health that we're gonna have to start discussing, because we're not just existing anymore. We now have a voice, and we now are very vocal about that, and that brings a different type of hate our way.
A double-edged sword, being visible. Sometimes but this is what bothers me sometimes about the entertainment field. It's always one-sided. Doesn't show the full dimensional characters that we are. I would love to see a show that has the collective set of friends that I have, that I sit at the table with. Now, as creative as I am, or flamboyant, or two-spirit, everybody in my circle is not Racine. You know, I have some of my fabulous girlfriends who are truck driver lesbians, or lipstick lesbians, and folks who are non-binary, and folks who just walk in their authentic selves, but it's so diverse. But unfortunately, we don't have enough of that in the entertainment field. It's always, if it's gonna be gay, oh, be super gay. Be gay to the 10th power, bam. But then it's a downside, because then when they see another side of someone who is part of the LGBT community that doesn't look like the show that they just turned off, it throws them. They go into, well, I don't understand, I'm confused. They're not, you are. So it's, you know, I just wish that sometimes it would be the full spectrum. What are 2 tips that you have for the LGBT people of color who identify competent and inclusive mental health treatments?
Okay, I guess I'll go.
It's your turn, Louis.
Soft peer pressure. Actually, don't, tips do not come to mind. I think that there's a lot of, at least for me, there's always been a lot of evaluation and examination about what exactly is driving me to seek mental health, because there are identities of mine that are very visible, but I've really walked through the world as a child who's still surviving the crack epidemic, right? You would only know that if I shared something, but like that's the lens that I'm always walking. Yeah, I'm, Afro-Latino, but it's through this lens of a child who is surviving crack still. I'm, a father, I'm queer, I'm HIV positive, but but my lens is always through, the little boy in me who is trying to matter, who is trying not to carry the shame that society has on his mother. Like that is always with me in every space. I may, be more Puerto Rican when I'm with my family, but I'm still that little boy. So like whenever I think about seeking mental health, I'm always coming from that lens. And that is a lens that a lot of people do not know how to deal with, right? It is, when surviving crack in 2019, I think now we're in a time where we have to like preserve that very traumatic and violent history because it has been erased, right? Like addiction now is very white, is very affluent, and the way we talk about it is very different than we talked about in 1989. Kids, their families were separated by crack many, many years ago. What this country is doing, they've been doing it to black and brown families for many years, is that they were doing to black and brown families that people didn't think that those mothers needed to keep their kids. So my tip is has always been for me to know that, to be okay with that, or to learn to be okay with that, to learn not to be ashamed of that's the lens I'm always moving in, and also being really intentional about this is the kind of support that I need. And it hasn't been easy in identifying a therapist, right? Because when you think, George alluded to this, when you are very public, you do have to move through healthcare very differently. And working in the field, when you're the person referring to agencies, it's harder to find, for me, it's been harder to find agencies to get support, because I often want to go to the same places I'm sending clients or patients or youth, but you can't go there because girls love to talk their asses off, right? So I guess the 2 tips I would share is really be intentional about the kind of support that you need, and not the support that people tell you that you need, or that the therapist or the caregiver or the provider tells you that you need. They are there to support you and guide you if it doesn't feel right. That does not mean that you are stupid, does not mean that you are somehow not following the regimen. Only you know what you need. And the second thing is to really be, and to find someone that you can have that conversation with. Like identifying a person who can walk you through that. When I got into my relationship with my partner, when I first started dating him, I had someone who said, "Oh my God, I love that you're dating somebody. Feel free to call me whenever you have questions or you're worried about if it's not working." And while that sounds really corny on the surface, I didn't feel like I was walking through this new love alone. And I didn't feel like when I needed to decompress or process someone that I was bothering someone by texting them, because this person identified that they would be a support system throughout the entire process. So again, like really be clear about and stand by what you need. And if the caregiver or the mental health professional can't give it to you, it is not your fault. Keep searching. And the second one is at least identify one person who you can unpack some of this stuff with, or even share, like, I don't know what I'm doing, or I think I might have messed something up. At least someone who can guide you and at least remind you on a physical level that you're not alone.
And that's important.
So I'd like to offer two, excuse me, and maybe a third. So one is always make sure to save a little of yourself for yourself. It's really, really important, because with greater visibility comes greater responsibility. And often you are pouring into folks and pouring into folks and pouring into folks until there's nothing left. So that's one piece of advice. Another is to seek help and allow the help to help. That's really, really important. Healthcare, we've heard it already several times. Healthcare, mental health care in particular, looks very, very different when you're someone who is considered to be in the public eye. It can be challenging when you are attempting to see the same therapist as someone that you just referred the other day. You know, they think that we have it all together. Well, we may today, but tomorrow we may not. And that's really, really important to remember.
Just kind of along the lines of that, just don't isolate yourself, because I feel like a lot of times we think of ourselves as being a burden to others and not wanting to bother other people, but really putting yourself out there. And I'm actually telling myself that too, because, you know, I think that as a community, we feel like we don't want to, and again, just burdening other people, and we just feel like, you know, and a lot of times I know that our community is very communal, but sometimes there's this level of self-sufficiency that your family tries to uphold in other family members, and so you feel like you don't want to add on to other people, and so it's important to really just put yourself out there, text someone, even try to meet with someone on a monthly basis. Like, that's something I'm trying to do, where it's like at least you have 1 or 2, 3 people that you can just meet up with in person. I feel like social media can be very isolating, and so kind of moving away from the computer and really having those face-to-face conversations can be really important.
So I have, I think, like 2 quick tips. The first is, there's something Maya Angelou always says. She said, about how, like, she could never figure out how good morning, how are you became so common. Like, how people just was like, oh, good morning, how are you? Oh, I'm fine, how are you? And they just went on with their day. So when people ask me how I am, I actually say how I am. No matter who it is. If somebody says, oh, good morning, how are you? If it's a bad day, I tell them, and literally I'll bullet point out what's right and what's not right now. The other person on the other end, they may receive it and say, oh, well, I don't have the capacity to deal with that right now, and they move on. But every now and then a friend will be like, okay, wait a minute, I'm gonna call you, or like, let's FaceTime, let's go through this. So if you're actually not okay and someone asks you, how are you, tell them that you're not okay. That's, I think, something that we just need to get back to doing in terms of communication. And I feel like texting and social media kind of has started to remove the human connection that we used to have when we used to have to talk on the phone, and we didn't have enough minutes, so you had to wait till after 9, and we didn't have texting, and we didn't have all these great, wonderful things. So that's number 1. Number 2 is self-care. Self-care can be as big as a vacation, but it can be as small as taking 15 minutes and going and having a Pepsi and a donut by yourself. That's my one thing of self-care, like when I'm really, really running, like traveling and meetings and writing and all that stuff. If I have to take a minute, usually I'll just go get a Pepsi and just go away by myself for 15 minutes, kind of decompress, and then come back to whatever it is that I'm doing. The third and final thing that I do, every day I take a fast from my phone, either between 30 minutes to an hour, and I just put my phone somewhere where I can't get to it, or I'll go for a walk and leave the phone in the house and make sure I know that I walk far enough away and far enough back that 30 minutes at minimum has passed, because we're just so connected to our phones nowadays, and sometimes it's really, you just really need to like remove yourself from it. I have like 51,000 followers on Twitter now, and like because I work in like multiple industries, like I get emails at any hour of the night, because an exec that's reviewing something I'm working on can be anywhere in the world and send an email. So like, they just have to wait till I come back to my phone. Like, but you can't always just be connected to your friends and to whatever situations are going on. So I just suggest that like maybe start off slow, 15 to 20 minutes a day. You just put your phone somewhere and you just get off of it. And I think that also helps with like barriers and creating barriers for yourself.
And that's so important. I think about, there was a time, believe it or not, I was not on social media at all. I used to tell people Facebook is the devil. I'm not getting on Facebook. Are you live? Putting all my information in my pictures. I don't want people, oh no, I don't want them folks. But I live for it. I do live for it. I've embraced it. But I see the downside of it. I see the social curse of social media. When folks get into these arguments that are toxic, and folks start chiming in, and then somebody adds your name onto it, and then they want you to chime in on it, and I act like I ain't never see it. I'll be giving, nope, I ain't chiming on and on. And it's toxic, and it's ugly, and sometimes you have to tell toxic people, stop. It's a wonderful thing. I've just learned and realized I can unfriend and block folks. I'll be unfriending. Oh, I got to unfriend that. That's negative. I unfriend it. I ain't. And be careful what you're listening to. Some of the music y'all listening to now, I understand now. I can dip it low and drop it with the rest of you, baby. I can pop lock it and twirl it and twerk it and throw it up. I like some of that stuff from Nicki Minaj. Likes all that. I like Big Frida and all of that. I like it. It's good to hear it. Some of it, sometimes you got to shake it up sometimes. But if you listen to some of the other stuff that's out there, it is sad. It's heartbreaking. Folks come along and drive up to you and they playing that loud music and you listen to the lyrics and I'll be like, oh my Lord, child. Child, louder. You be at the bus stop like, oh, child, what are they listening to? But you got to be careful what you're listening to and what you in space, and sometimes you got to leave some of your coworkers alone. Sometimes coworkers are toxic. Sometimes you in a toxic environment at work, sitting at lunch, and they come in. Have you ever said somebody, you talk about speaking to each other. Some folks come and you say good morning. They come in and they sit down. Oh, well, it ain't so good. I'll tell you why it ain't good. And then they just tell you everything. And that's every day with them. Every day. Now, I understand you can have a bad day. We all have bad days. I get up on the wrong side of it. I understand. Cable due is bill. Light bill is due. I'm depressed too. Bank account ain't quite where it should be. I'm understanding that. But when folks come to you every time and their spirit is so toxic, you got to, not today. Not today. You see, as soon as you see it, you got to say, okay, bye. Or don't walk and sit in them spaces. Don't listen to those music. And then sometimes sometimes folks look to you, all of you. You're happy. You inspire people to live, to be better, to talk about, to help. But then times folks look at you and say, child, I want you to be the Superman or the Superwoman. I want you to be my Wonder Woman or Superman. You say, I can't jump on that train today. I can't be Batman. I can't be the X-Men or the Avengers or any of them today. Because like you say, George, this is where I'm at. And sometimes you have to be willing to tell people, girl, this is where I'm at today. Sit down. I want you to tell you all my problems. You got 20 minutes? Well, you're going to need 30. And sometimes you got to say, like you say, be willing to pour out sometimes. And say, just listen. And sometimes it's always good to have a folk who can listen. Just listen. Don't say nothing. Just listen. Folks call me 2, 3 o'clock in the morning. I'll be like, oh, Lord. As long as ain't nobody die, I'm all right. But sometimes you just got to listen. And sometimes folks just want to vent. They don't want to hear. They don't want to hear, oh, child, you need this, you need that. They just want you to listen. And sometimes you have to be that ear and just say, okay, the bill is in the mail. And just listen. And to all of you, can you share a story of resilience for LGBT people of color? Each one of you. a story of resilience.
A personal story.
How have you, yes, yes, honey, yes. Yes, I want to feel like Oprah. This is Super Sunday. Share.
So I'll start again. So speaking from the perspective of a black woman and black womanhood and black trans womanhood, stories of resilience are abundant. But sometimes you just have to listen for them or have your eyes open for them. There are people who are in places across the country, trans women who are doing absolutely amazing work. There's Yvonne Kao in Mississippi who has created this bubble of resources for folks in her community. And there's Dee Dee Shambly and some other folks who are doing great work in Atlanta. And there's Mother Major and Sharon Grayson, who opened Gigi's House in Arkansas, who are doing impactful healing work for transgender folks, in spite of the fact that everything in the world, including our president, is saying that, number one, we shouldn't exist and we don't have a right to happiness. And so when I see folks who are thriving, when at least once a week we're hearing a story and reading a story and sharing on social media about how another black trans woman, let me add that part in, about how another black trans woman is being murdered simply for being who she is, resilience is still, in spite of that, continuing to do what's necessary, not just for yourself, but for others as well.
Each one. I want you to all give us a takeaway.
I got one here. I'm really not this quiet.
I know we've seen your YouTube. You a chatty catty.
Now, I guess, there are many, but when you said about listening, I used to do, in another life, I was a spoken word artist. And I know, right? So but that was many, many moons ago. And we used to do poetry workshops at youth study centers. And that is what we call places where they hold young people that they've separated from their families. And it was North Philly, black and brown, black and primarily Puerto Rican and Dominican young boys, and we would be there every Tuesday having to do a poetry workshop. And the space we were there every Tuesday because the young people it was a transition space. So it was either young people who had come home from long-term placement and were ready to be transitioned back into their family, or young boys who were just recently separated from their families and on their way to long-term placement. So some weeks we'd see the same young men, but most of the times it was an influx of different young men. And so we're doing this poetry workshop, and me and my best friend are reading our poems. And, and if you are a performer, you typically, at least for me, I pick up on the people who laugh, who giggle, who go like this. And that gives you more like, bitch, I'm doing it, right? And there was this one Puerto Rican boy, he was just stone-faced. He was like, and of course, and I'm like, what the hell? He wasn't getting any of my jokes. I know I was funny. And we're reciting all these poems, which were hella good. And so I'm watching him, and so I was like, okay, but maybe it's just my first poem. Maybe he doesn't connect with a crack mom. Got it. Not everybody has one. But I watched him respond to other people's, again, the rest of my teams. It was me, Michael, and Samantha. And the same thing. I'm like, what the hell? Does he not like poetry? Is he dead inside? And so they're like, Louis, you got to go again. And I'm like, damn, I do not want to go. The boy does not like us. But of course, I can't say that. But I'm obsessing on his lack of response. So the poetry workshop comes to an end, and part of it was us giving out free chapbooks that we would create at our office. So some of the young boys are coming up, getting a chapbook, and this boy is still sitting down I don't want that piece of shit. And I'm like, what the hell is going on? Like, I'm totally like centering myself, my feelings. I'm making up stories about like why he doesn't, oh, is it because my voice is light, or because I'm gay, he doesn't like us, because we're not too masculine. So I'm making up all this shit in my head. And so we wrap up and we're heading out, and my staff walks up ahead, and I, stop to tell our contacts, like, thank you, we'll see you next week. And my staff walks out the door, and there's a couch, because it's like a living room. And so I'm walking, and as soon as I get to the door, I hear, get him, he's running. So I turn back to see what was happening behind me, because I could hear the guards calling on each other to catch someone who was running. And he was jumping over the couch, and it was the boy who had no reaction. So I'm like, what the hell is going on? And he says in Spanish, can I get your last book? And so I gave him the book, and I left there, and I was like, all this time I had been obsessing with the response that I was looking for. And the whole time he was taken in the workshop and was risk being attacked by the guards to get, before we left, and I try to remember that, because it was like this, even goes to what you said, we're looking for how resilience looks or how connections look, and they don't look and sound the way we think they always do. And this whole time I'm minimizing his existence during our workshop, centering myself, making up stories, having this fucking trauma response. And he was risking being attacked by guards to ask for a book. And I think that I try to remember that anytime I'm in these kinds of spaces, anytime that I'm interacting with someone, to make also so that I'm not minimizing my impact, but also that I'm not looking for what is just going to feed my ego, what is going to make me feel good in the moment. We are going to connect with each other. And even if he never came up to ask for the book, that didn't mean that the connection we were building as a community didn't matter. It didn't, I don't know what kind of conversations he would have had later on. So I try to remember that, and I hope that people get that if you are ever working with young people, young black and brown people, that sometimes they are not going to applaud, and they're not going to nod their head, and they're not going to smile, because their way of processing and connecting with you can be private, it can be individual, and it can be internal. But that was almost 20 years ago, and it still moves me, and it still reminds me not to center my damn self all the damn time.
Dior and DeGeorge.
This is gonna sound, well, it's not gonna sound, it is a book plug. But in my book, The Color of My Mind, there are, that it's about mental health narratives from people of color, and a large amount of people in the book identify as LGBTQ. And so if you definitely wanna, read the stories, it's, available on my website. But the thing that I really wanted to highlight was, I interviewed 34 individuals, and it was amazing to be able to be in that space where some of them were friends, or some of them were acquaintances, some of them just put themselves out there, and that was something that I thought was very brave and courageous of each and every one of them. And one question that I asked during the interview was, what do you love about yourself? And that was the question that was the hardest one for people of color to answer. And see, you started this, the tears. Basically, the resounding response from these queer people of color was, what do I love about myself? That I'm still here. So for me, that's something that we can carry and hold on to, because despite everything that's going on in this world and in this country, we're still here and we're not going anywhere.
How about that? Before George gives us that final thought, to the folks in Facebook land, turn the camera this way. Yeah. Make sure you're in my good light. At this point, we're concluding our Facebook Live. Thank you for tuning in. Remember to like and share. And remember to follow Racine, RAYCEEN, on all forms of social media.